Welcome to this session about developing parenting plans. So today in this webinar, I'm going to firstly talk and explain a little bit more about what it is that parenting plans are all about and how you make them, why you want one. We'll then move on to talk about the specific parts of parenting plans that talk about parenting time, followed by the parts that talk about how you agree to make decisions about your children. I'll then run through some resources, and then at the end, we'll have time for some questions and comments. So, parenting plans, what they are and why they're useful. So, a parenting plan is the part of a court order and an agreement that you might reach with your ex or an arbitrator's award that talk about how parents will care for their kids after separation. They usually talk at a minimum about the schedule of the children's time between the children's parents, other important people such as grandparents, aunts, uncles, maybe close family friends. Sometimes they talk about who the guardians of a child are, and that's important because it's guardians who get to make decisions about children. And then they also talk about how those guardians go about making decisions for their kids. The schedule of the children's time between their parents is also called access. You've probably heard about that. Parenting time, contact. Contact under the Alberta Family Law Act is specifically contact between a child and somebody who isn't a guardian. And of course, you can be a parent and not be a guardian. The people who are the guardians of a child who get to make decisions under the Divorce Act, that's called custody. Under the Family Law Act of Alberta and most of the provinces, it's called guardianship. How parents and guardians go about making decisions for their kids is also part of custody under the Divorce Act. You've heard it described as guardianship, parental responsibilities. In British Columbia, it's called decision-making responsibilities. And under Alberta's Family Law Act, this is called the powers and responsibilities of guardianship. Parenting plans will often be part of that larger document, whether it's a court order, an agreement between you and your ex, or an award from an arbitrator that talk about other things, such as how property is divided, how debt gets divided, about child support, paying for kids' special expenses, and spousal support. But those are not part of what we sort of think of as being a parenting plan. So you've heard me use a lot of different language, and that's because we have the Federal Divorce Act, which is common to all of Canada. And then we have the Family Law Act, which is only for people who live within Alberta. And these two different pieces of legislation use different language to talk about these things. And making everything just a little bit more complicated, the Federal Divorce Act will be changing on the 1st of March 2021 to use new language and new concepts. So under the current Divorce Act, when we talk about children's schedules, their time between parent A and parent B, the current Divorce Act talks about that in terms of access, but it's also kind of rolled into custody because custody is also about sort of having the children's home, the place where they live, which is also about decision making, and I'll get there in a second. The new Federal Divorce Act is going to use language that is almost exactly the same as the language we use in Alberta and in other provinces such as British Columbia. This will make life easier for everybody because under the Divorce Act and the Provincial Family Law Act, when we talk about the schedule of a children's time between their parents or guardians, we're going to be talking about parenting time. And under the new Divorce Act and the existing Family Law Act, when we talk about kids' contacts with people that aren't parents and people who aren't guardians, that's called contact. Under the current Federal Divorce Act, when we talk about how decisions get made about children, that's all bundled into what we think of as custody. Under the changed Divorce Act come March the 1st, we'll be talking about this in terms of decision-making responsibility. Under Alberta's legislation, it's the powers, responsibilities, and entitlements of guardianship. And I like the Divorce Act language, if only because it's ever so much shorter. And so I'll just leave you with the rest of the screen because I want to make sure that I get to some of the more important things. But just suffice it to say that right now, the Divorce Act and Alberta's Family Law Act use really different language and different concepts to talk about all these things, decision-making and children's schedule between their parents' homes. When the Divorce Act gets changed, it's going to be almost the same as the Alberta Family Law Act. So when are parenting plans made? Well, they are almost always made after parents have separated. And the reason for that is that when you're just starting a relationship where you're just thinking about having kids, well, you really can't predict what the future is going to hold. You don't know if you're going to separate, and if you suspect you're going to separate, you probably don't know when. And in between the date that you get into your relationship and the date that the relationship comes to an end, if it comes to an end, who knows what's going to change? Your work life may have changed, your spouse's work life may have changed, you may have developed a disability that impacts your capacity to parent. So in general, we never see language about caring for children or children's parenting schedule in things like marriage agreements, living together agreements, cohabitation agreements, and the other kinds of things that people might sign at the beginning of a relationship. Now, there's one big exception to this, and the exception has to do with circumstances in which a child is being born as a result of assisted reproduction. In a case like that, it's possible in certain provinces, including Alberta, that the people who want to be the parents of a child can make an agreement with somebody who is the donor of eggs or sperm, or somebody who is a surrogate mother that might say who is and who isn't a parent of the child, and might actually provide a schedule of time that that person might have with the child once the child is born. And the people who make parenting plans, anybody who's a parent, and not to beat a dead horse or to state the obvious, but people who are parents include people who are married to each other. It includes people who are living together in long-term unmarried relationships that we sometimes think of as being common law relationships or adult interdependent partnerships. Of course, you can also have a child if you're just dating somebody or if you're not dating anybody at all. And so anybody who is a parent, regardless of the nature of your relationship with the other parent, you're somebody that can make a parenting plan. What matters is that you have a child and you have another parent with whom you have to work to make decisions. The other people in Alberta who might make a parenting plan are people who are guardians, because remember that in Alberta, you can be a guardian and not be a parent, or be a parent and not qualify as a guardian. And so there's no limit on the number of guardians a child might have. And if you're asking yourself, how could it be that you could be a parent and not be a guardian? Well, you might be a parent and not be a guardian if the child was the product of a very brief relationship and you and the other parent were never living together and you never lived with the child. You could be a guardian while not being a parent if, for example, let's say a parent of the child develops a substance abuse problem. And sometimes when that happens, grandmother or grandpa will take the child into their home and care for them. In a case like that, to make sure that grandma or grandpa are able to make decisions, to communicate with the school and communicate with the child's doctors and teachers and all the rest, well, you might agree that grandma or grandpa should also be a guardian of a child. There's one other class of circumstance when somebody might be making a parenting plan who isn't a parent or a guardian, and that's when you're dealing with a caseworker from Alberta Children's Services when there's a child welfare concern. In certain cases, your caseworker might work with you and the other parent to develop a parenting plan as perhaps a condition of being released from supervision by the child protection people. So, how do you make a parenting plan? Well, it's easy enough. So if you don't have to go to court or you don't have to go see an arbitrator, well, you can negotiate with the other parent. You bargain with the other parent, and your goal is to reach an agreement, a compromise, usually, that you're both as happy with as possible. This might be part of a separation agreement, and a separation agreement is usually something much bigger that also talks about child support, spousal support, sometimes the division of property, the division of debt, and stuff like that. But so if it's a separation agreement, usually it deals with parenting as well as most of the other issues that are involved in family law. Or you could just have an agreement that just talks about parenting the child. That could be appropriate if you and the other parent can only agree on that stuff now, and you're going to leave the other things to worry about later. Or if the child was the product of a really short relationship and there aren't issues about property to figure out. So that might be called a parenting agreement. And this bargaining process might occur in the form of negotiation, and you negotiate with people all the time. You negotiate with your employer, your next door neighbor, sometimes you negotiate with your spouse. Mediation is a dispute resolution process where you and the other parent go see a neutral third party, a mediator, and they help you work things out. Collaborative negotiation is a kind of bargaining involving lawyers who are specially trained and sometimes people who are experts on parenting issues, and sometimes they'll have input. If you can't agree, or at least there's a very low likelihood that you're going to be able to agree, sometimes a parent might start a lawsuit by going to court and then asking a judge to make a decision for them. And what the judge produces is something called a court order. And the process that is involved in lawsuits is called litigation. Or if you can't agree, you might agree to hire an arbitrator. The thing about going to court is that you don't need anybody else's permission to start a lawsuit. You just go ahead and do that. And the other side, well, they don't have to agree to participate in the litigation, because if they don't participate, the judge might make an order without hearing from them. But with arbitration, you actually have to get the other side to agree that you should arbitrate the dispute. And even though arbitration is adversarial, just like court processes are, and just like going to court, you're having a neutral third party, in this case, an arbitrator, not a judge, making a decision. The benefit of arbitration is that you get to pick the person who's going to be your judge. So that means that you can pick somebody that is not only an expert in family law, but perhaps somebody who's an expert in family law, as well as making decisions about parenting plans. So that's an important consideration that can really make it an advantage over going to court. So why do you make a parenting plan? Well, firstly, they're really important because they are a written record of the arrangements that you've made about the schedule of the children's time and the deal that you've made about how it is that you're going to go about making decisions on, on behalf of the children. The point of all of this is so that you've got that written record so that nobody gets to argue about what it says or doesn't say in the future. If there's any question about who gets to make a decision about whether it's going to be soccer versus baseball this summer, well, you go back to the agreement, and the agreement will say who gets to make that decision. If you can't decide what's going to happen during the summer, well, you go back to the agreement, and the agreement is usually going to contain some kind of a statement about how the summer vacation gets split up. So their job is to reduce conflict by providing certainty, creating that common written record that both of you can refer to in the event that you disagree about what the deal was. These also can be used to help you deal with problems coming up in the future that you hadn't anticipated, right? So you may not have thought that you're going to find yourself arguing about soccer versus baseball, but somewhere in the parenting plan, a good parenting plan will talk about who gets to make decisions or how decisions are made about extracurricular activities. And in a way, this winds up helping you predict the future, because if you always know how summers get split up or how the winter break gets split up, well, you can plan right now in 2020 for Christmas 2021 and make your arrangements and book flights to wherever it is that we're going to be allowed to fly to this time next year. And so the point of all of this is that by creating that written record, by creating that certainty, we're reducing conflict. Why is reducing conflict important? Well, the social science research about how well children adapt to and adjust to their parents' separation, and how well children do after their parents' separation, shows that there are two main factors that are involved in children's successful adjustment. First, the nature and the quality of the child's relationship with each of their parents. And secondly, the intensity and the duration of the parents' conflict with each other. That's really important. And if there's a good reason to make a parenting plan, it's this. It's to avoid conflict and promote your children's short and long-term well-being. Now, parenting plans, of course, can't be carved in stone, right? And it's easy to think of why. The parenting plan that is suitable for an infant isn't going to be suitable for a toddler who's entering preschool, and the parenting plan that's suitable for a toddler isn't going to be appropriate for a 13-year-old who has a social calendar and a list of interests and priorities that are more likely than not going to include you. And so as a result, you must never think of a parenting plan as being fixed in stone, as being incapable of change and never going to change. It will change. The only time when a parenting plan may never need to be adjusted is if you make it at a time when the kids are already maybe 13, 14, or 15, and the parenting plans that you make for them can just sort of be let to ride until they finish high school. So parenting plans change because children's needs change as they grow older.
they become more mature and more independent as their social needs evolve and the focus of their life changes from themselves and you, to including themselves in a peer group at school, and as children's preferences and priorities evolve. Parenting plans sometimes also change because the parenting capacities and the parenting capacities and skills of a particular parent may change as time passes. Sometimes a parent's ability to parent improves over time. For example, somebody who has a problem with alcohol might get treatment, they might get sober, and that might increase their capacity to parent. Somebody who was never involved in the kids' lives while their relationship was intact may wind up taking on a lot more responsibility once the parents have separated, or they might take a parenting class or the parenting after separation course, improving their skills and their ability to care for a child. On the negative side, well, a parent might develop a chronic medical condition that might limit their physical ability to parent a child, or a mental health disorder that has an impact on their ability to care for a child. The point of all of this is that this is not carved in stone. There are lots of very good reasons why a parenting plan may need to change, whether it's a change in the circumstances and capacities of the kids or a change in the circumstances and capacities of the parents. But all of these changes are normal. There's nothing wrong with them. And the adjustment of parenting plans is something that you always should be planning for and expecting. So, like I said at the beginning, there are these two major components to parenting plans. Firstly, and sometimes most controversially, the parenting schedule. So let's talk about these. In general, the things you want to think about when you're making plans for parenting time are the age of the children, the children's maturity, and the children's stage of development. Another key factor can be the kids' special needs. I'm going to talk about both of these in a little more detail later on, but the gist of it all is this. Kids who are younger generally need to see their parents more often, but for shorter periods of time than older kids do. It's easy to think of, for example, how a 9-year-old could be completely comfortable with a parenting schedule where they are with one parent for a whole week and with the other parent for a whole week. But a child who is a toddler wouldn't be able to manage that. On the other hand, kids who have special needs, for example, things like autism, often require a great deal more certainty in their parenting plans. So kids like that might benefit from a greater degree of similarity in the patterns of parenting between one home and the other home. Similarities in terms of bedtimes, homework expectations, bedtime routines, waking up routines, and might need to spend more time with one parent than the other. It all depends. Another factor that's really important is the nature of the child's relationship with each parent. As I'm going to say in a few minutes, there is no one parenting plan that is right for all kids in all families in all circumstances. And the reality is that a child may have a much greater degree of attachment to one particular parent than the other parent. That may be because the parent to whom the child is less attached worked outside the home for the majority of the relationship or just wasn't there. It may be because that parent is an authoritarian disciplinarian. There could have been because of family violence. There are lots of other reasons why there might be an important difference between the child's relationship with one parent and the child's relationship with another parent. The other really important thing to think about, of course, is the fundamental skills of the parents and their ability to parent a child. So, we look at things like, is family violence an issue? If so, what kind of family violence? Is it situational family violence that maybe occurred once and once only when the couple were separating? Or is it a pattern of coercive control? Or what are the other characteristics of the family violence? And how does the family violence impact on the aggressor's ability to properly care for a child? We also want to think about the level of conflict between the parents, and as I'll tell you in a few more slides, the more high conflict parents are, the more detailed their parenting plan needs to be. On the other hand, the less conflict they have, the more ambiguous and flexible their parenting schedule can be. And then you think about practical things, right? So, for example, you might have an arrangement where maybe mom sees the kids every Tuesday and every Thursday for dinner. And that might be fine while everybody is living in the farthest north part of Calgary. But let's say one of the parents moves down to Mackenzie Town or somewhere else in the bowels of the city. Well, that plan to spend a couple of hours with mom that may have worked just fine when the parents were only a 10-minute drive apart may not work as well when they're now about an hour apart, especially if you have to drive through rush hour traffic to get there. So it needs to be practical. It needs to be doable. You can't have these plans that require an extraordinary amount of driving because not only will that drive you nuts, it's also going to drive the kids nuts. Other things to think about, this is just a grab bag, include things like, well, what was the schedule of parenting time and the arrangements that you made during your relationship? Did you have a pattern that you'd already established? What was the role of each of that each of the parents played during the relationship? What was the different levels of each parent's engagement in things like the children's social lives, in their schooling, in their homework, in extracurricular activities such as team sports and things like that? Are there differences in how the parents approach disciplining their kids? Do either of the parents have new relationships? Does the new partner have children? What's that relationship going to look like? Will that person play a role in parenting the child, or will they be hands off? What are the parents' plans for their own lives? Is it the case that somebody's going to school now and they're going to be finished school soon and be more available to the kids? Are they progressing in their career? Is there a possibility that one of them might want to move away? So all these things are sort of things that you have to be alive to. And because all of these things and some of the things I put on this screen as well are different for everybody, that's why there is not one single parenting plan that works best for everybody. Now, there's one thing that I want to talk about, and this relates to the idea about the roles that the parents played during the relationship. I've been practicing family law for something on the order of 20 years. And, not to be too unkind, but I have a series of questions that I call the guy questions, because they're questions that men typically can't answer. Like, what was the date on which you got married? Or trick questions like, who is your child's grade 2 teacher? Stuff like that. And the thing is, it's not fair for me to always ask these questions, and it's not fair for me to jokingly label them as the man questions. And the reason for that is this. Um, Parents who are in an intact relationship, just like all people, have different strengths and weaknesses. Whether those strengths are because they have a particular interest in something or they just happen to be good at that thing. And then people have lots of weaknesses in the sense that, well, for example, it's always my partner who manages our bank accounts and makes sure that the credit card statements are correct and don't have any weird billings. I'm no good at finances, so I never do that. But what I am good at is I'm really good at staying on top of the children's vaccination schedule, making sure that they have regular annual physicals with their GP, making sure that they get off to see their endocrinologist and the child's counselors and the dentist and all those other things, right? And so as a result, during a relationship, each parent's strengths tend to offset the other parent's weaknesses. And if both parents are weak on a particular thing, such as scheduling, well, you usually develop a coping strategy. Like we'll always enter in the date of the children's brownies and the date of soccer practice, and it will always go into a shared calendar that we can both access on our phones, right? But the reality, though, is that because of these different strengths and weaknesses, whether it's because of actual skill about a particular thing or a particular interest, such as somebody who's particularly interested in making sure the kids are having a healthy diet, parents are better at different things and adopt different roles. So quite often, it is usually the case that the parent who is at home the most is the parent who looks after things like securing daycare, arranging who the babysitters are going to be, making decisions about the school schedule, when the kids are going to go for their checkup with the dentist or with the doctor. It's usually that person who goes to parent-teacher meetings, right? On the other hand, the parent who's not mostly inside the home might be the parent who's better at doing the books or is better at providing for the family or better at scheduling vacations and travel schedules and things like that. The problem, though, is that when parents separate, those strengths and weaknesses are sort of shoved into a stark contrast because the parent who's best at the books, but not the best at booking doctor's appointments and taking care of parent-child interviews, doesn't have that weakness offset by the other parent living in the home. As well, parents' individual parenting styles are sort of, when they're not buffered by the presence of the other parent. So if one parent, for example, tends to be, I don't know, what would you, a harsh disciplinarian, right? It's 9 o'clock, you're late for bed, get to bed now, do your homework, it's 7:30, you need to be putting away your screen, something like that. If the other parent who's maybe more lax about that thing and doesn't really care when the kids go to bed, well, so as a result, the life in each parent's home will sometimes be very different. And the problem this makes in terms of conflict is it means that the parent who knows the answer to the guy questions gets to go to court and say things like, he doesn't even know who the child's GP is, or when's the last time the kids went to see the dentist, and do you remember if they had any cavities? And it makes the other parent look less competent. But the reality is that, well, they have different things that they happen to be good at, because during the relationship, they divided up the tasks involved in running the house and caring for the kids. So please be aware that this is normal, that it's natural, that in general, the strengths that you have are offset by weaknesses in the other parent, and the other parent's strengths are offset by weaknesses that you have. Please think about this and be kind to each other. Just remember that you're not living with the other parent and able to fill in the holes that their parenting style presents. So, as I've said before, there is no such thing as a right, mandatory, or recommended parenting plan, at least not in Alberta. Other jurisdictions, typically outside of Canada, in fact, have parenting schedules that are recommended, including some that are part of the rules of court. And so if you want to help figuring out a parenting plan, just do a Google search for parenting plan or time sharing or child time sharing, parenting after separation, parenting schedule, language like that. But do remember that whatever the parenting schedule looks like, this needs to be the schedule that works for you, the schedule that works for your ex, and the schedule that works for your kids. And as a result, the parenting arrangements that may have worked out best for your buddy when your buddy got separated and split up from their partner may not be the ones that are best for you, right? And there's no particular right way of doing it. And of course, there are lots of wrong ways of doing it. And also remember that the goal of your parenting plan is to eliminate conflict. So you may need to be particularly specific about stuff that particularly bothers you or bothers your ex. So, for example, my ex celebrates the winter and the summer solstices. So we need to make sure that our parenting plan makes sure that our kids are with her for the winter solstice and the summer solstice. So, and when you Google parenting schedules, you'll find all different kinds of things. So this is a schedule that's provided by a psychologist named Robert Adler. It goes on, of course, to deal with kids who are in their teens. But one of the important things that I want you to take away from this is that you'll see that the recommended parenting schedule is different depending on the age of the child. And so when you're looking online for parenting schedules, you want to pay attention to schedules that are geared to the age of the child, the maturity of the child, and the independence of the child. The other thing that's helpful to look for are parenting plans that differentiate between parents with excellent parenting skills and parents with weaker parenting skills, right? In general, parents with better parenting skills are more likely to have a lot more time with the kids than parents who have poor parenting skills. So here's one from this one website, mediate.com. Robert Adler, same website, has a different list of proposals provided by another mental health professional, a child developmental psychologist named William Hodges. And just like the other one I showed you, this one also breaks it down by age. So birth to 6 months, 6 months to 18 months, 18 months to 3 years, and so on. These are some of the rules provided by some of the American jurisdictions, and you can find these all over the place. Oregon's got them, Colorado, Arizona, Idaho, and a few more. But here's some from Indiana. And so when you find this and you click on the links, you'll see that there are all these parenting schedules that are geared to the age of the child and different parenting capacities. And there they are right down there, and under Section 2, specific parenting time provisions. The same search will reveal another website called Custody Exchange, which is a commercial service. But what's helpful here is that, again, you see parenting plans that are geared to the child's age, whether they're in school or not, and things like that. So let's sort of begin at the beginning, and I'll give you some thoughts about parenting schedules for infants and toddlers. Let me first say that, without a doubt, the most difficult scenarios that I'm ever asked to deal with involve the parenting of very, very young children. It's very difficult because, especially for parents where this is their first child, right? I mean, you remember when you had your first child and you would read all those books like What to Expect When You're Expecting, and what they would say in that book would be flatly contradicted by what Dr. Spock had to say, which would in turn be contradicted by another parenting book. So there's a lot of anxiety that builds up about, how to best parent your children. And of course, people have their own views about parenting that they, generally speaking, learned from their parents. So with infants, the most vexing problems involve issues about breastfeeding. They involve issues about the non-residential parent's time with the child, time outside the home, the circumstances in which that time will happen, all very difficult. But from the point of view of the child, and I'm talking now about the psychological development of the child, it is widely believed to be the case that between birth and 18 months are the most critical time in the development of the child. It sets the patterns for the child's ability to attach to a parent, and the attachment style that a child displays to a parent, generally speaking, is the same attachment style that they're going to have when they grow up and have adult relationships of their own, relationships with spouses and other parents, and relationships with their own children. Some psychologists also say that that period from 0 to 18 months is also critical in the forming of the child's personality and fundamental predispositions. It's absolutely amazing how critical that initial period can be. And given how much this age is important to attachment styles, it is especially important because attachment styles relate strongly to the child's adjustment to the separation of their parents, but also to their short and long-term psychosocial functioning. So it really is a critical phase. So if an infant is at home around the age of 6 to 7 months, you become real people for them in the sense that they recognize you as a consistent, stable feature of their universe, and the attachment process really begins to sink in, right? You're bonding with the child, you're interacting with the child becomes used to seeing your face. A child who is well and securely attached to you knows that even though they get upset when you leave the room and they may cry for a bit, you'll be back. A securely attached child knows that if they fall and hurt themselves, that you will be there to comfort them, that you will change them when they're wet and uncomfortable, that you will feed them when they're hungry. And those are all good attachment qualities. So if both parents are there, present in the child's life, the research shows that both parents will be well attached, the child will be well attached to both parents. It was at one point believed, by the way, that if an attachment to a parent didn't form in those first 18 months, that the attachment could not form later on in life. That's actually been proven not to be true, even though that initial set of months is still critically important, right? A solid attachment can still form with another parent, so don't worry about that. But, worry about it because it means that you have to make a point of being involved in the child's life. Just know that it's not an invariable rule that no further attachments form beyond that initial 18-month period. So if both parents are involved in the child's life, the child becomes aware of both of them and attaches to both. If the child has somebody who takes the primary role, almost to the exclusion of the other parent, there may only be one attachment bond between the child and the residential parent. If the parents live apart, the best parenting arrangements usually involve frequent time with the child, but not time that's horrifically extended. Parents need to work together to make sure that how they parent the child on a functional day-to-day basis is roughly the same between both households. And that will help the child adjust to the transition between parents and the transition between homes. And so the parenting skills that I'm talking about are things like When does feeding occur? How does feeding occur? When do naps happen? What is the soothing pattern that goes into getting the child ready for sleep? What kind of play activities are available? What kind of soothers and other physical toys are available for the child? So to give you some ideas about some specific parenting plans, arrangements for parenting schedules when kids are this young, if the child is well attached to both parents, well, you can have all sorts of arrangements. You want to keep at the forefront of your mind the idea about short but frequent. So one pattern could be every Tuesday and every Thursday for 2 to 4 hours, plus an entire overnight period from Saturday morning until Sunday morning on each and every weekend. Another schedule could be two 24-hour periods, one in the middle of the week, say on Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, followed by another on the weekend. Or you could mix them up and have two 2 to 4 hour periods during the midweek, or one followed by a 48-hour schedule on the weekend. Of course, we have to assume that breastfeeding either is not an issue, or that feeding can be accommodated in terms of pumping and the storage of milk. But remember, short, frequent times. Now, when a child is not well attached to both parents, in other words, has one primary attachment, usually to the residential parent, well, you probably are going to be looking at a parenting schedule where the infant is with the other parent less often and maybe for shorter periods of time. So we're talking about 2 to 4 visits a week of 1 to 4 hours in a neutral setting that is well supported. Well supported may be having the other parent's mom in the picture helping out with parenting issues, or it may be that the parents are both together during the other parent's parenting time. However that schedule works, over time, the general expectation is that the non-residential parent's time with the child is going to extend, so that 2 hours becomes 3 hours, and 3 hours become 4 hours. And at the same time, by the way, instead of having, 1 hour 4 times a week, well, maybe if you're up to 2 hours, maybe it's 2 hours 3 times a week, and that kind of an arrangement. But so the triggers that would cause an increase in the other parent's time with the child usually be things like, you can see that there's an obvious and a palpable connection between the child and the parent. The child is comfortable being left with the parent. The other parent has demonstrated skills about feeding the child, changing the child, basic things like that. And it continues on after that to include overnights eventually as time goes on. In cases like this, especially when there's a difference in the quality of the relationship between parent A and parent B, it's really important that both parents are on the same page about things like medical care and medications, bedtimes and bedtime routines, soothing exercises, feeding and diet, and all that other kind of basic day-to-day stuff. Now, when the kids are older and they go to school, their lives change. For kids who are at home, the entire world revolves around them. They are these wonderful little balls of ego, and they measure life in terms of how well and how quickly mom and dad respond to my needs, right? They're, the existence of the world outside the doors of your house is completely irrelevant to them. But when kids start going to school, that first experience in kindergarten, junior kindergarten, pre-kindergarten, well, that's a huge change in children's lives. For some of them, especially the kids who don't have siblings, this may be the first time that they ever realize that adult caregivers have to devote their attention to other children, and that there are other children who are roughly their own age who also have needs that need to be accommodated. And frankly, one of the key functions of the early parts of grade school is actually about developing children's social skills, because in general, when they're at home, they don't have to do things like negotiate schedules on the swing, playground time, or disagreements with friends about what TV show they're going to watch, what video game they're going to play. And so one of the biggest things that happens between being at home with a parent and then finally starting pre-K, K, and grade 1 and all that is that change in focus, where it's less about the child and only the child, and all of a sudden the child's needs have to be tempered by the world around them. And as the child grows up, well, mom and dad become less and less important. Beginning sometime around age 9, age 10, Kids develop important and meaningful relationships with people outside the household who are their peers. They go on play dates, they begin spending time with them, maybe they go off on their own bicycle trips with their friends, and then eventually, heaven forbid, when they become preteens and teenagers, well, you and the other parent are quite frankly entirely unimportant to them because their social lives take primacy. So, the things you think about when you're developing plans for kids who are in school, and sorry, the other important thing about school is that before the kids started school, well, the plan was completely irrelevant to their school system. The only thing that you and the other parent had to think about when you're scheduling time with the kids is really your work schedules. But when the kids start school, all of a sudden there's an independent schedule that you have to comply with. So that's another big change. So considerations, special needs. In general, kids with special needs, depending on the type, need more and more regularity. They may benefit from having a mathematical division of time between parent A and parent B, or it may be more important to them and more valuable to them to spend time with one parent more than the other. You need to think about the quality of the child's relationship with each parent. This is beyond attachment at this point. We're also talking about, well, does the kid like mom or like dad? Because there are lots of reasons why a child might feel an affinity more towards one parent than the other. Might have to do with, for example, the level of the parent's involvement in the child's life, the presence of mental health or medical concerns that impact on the parent's ability to parent, and other things along those lines. You need to think about parenting skills and capacities, including, depending on how much time is involved, is the other parent able to work with the child on their homework, monitor their progress in school and compliance with school expectations? Are they able to take the child to sports practices, and are they able to take the child to games, and so on and so forth? Another important factor that far too many people don't even think about is the fact that the parent with whom the child lives the most often usually needs a break. There's nothing wrong with that. It's okay to want to have a weekend all to yourself or an evening all to yourself. There's nothing wrong with that. So think about that. And a closely related idea is about the importance of weekends. So while a child is not in school, weekends are kind of, well, just like any other day of the week, right? But for a child who's in grade 6, well, weekends are now important because that may be the only time that you get to take them to the West Edmonton Mall or Callaway Park or out horseback riding or camping and things like that. And so in addition to making sure that the residential parent gets a break from time to time, you also want to make sure that each of you have equal access to things like weekends so that you can do fun things with the kids that require planning, like making that special trip to Jasper. You need to support the child's relationship with the parent with whom the child does not live. So that's about thinking about things like contact by telephone, contact by FaceTime and Messenger, making sure that the child sees them on a fairly frequent basis. Another factor, and this is a really weird one, is about the child's capacity to understand time. So let me explain that for a little bit because it was really eye-opening for me when I first started thinking about this. But you know how right now for kids who celebrate Christmas, they're thinking about Christmas in terms of how many more sleeps is it until Santa comes, right? Well, the reason why kids talk about time in terms of sleeps is because they can't grasp the idea of, well, it's happening in 13 days, right? The idea of 13 days is beyond their capacity to grasp, but they can get the idea of number of times they have to go to sleep and wake up. And so this is really important because, you probably remember, in fact, summer holidays, right? As an adult, I look at my kids' summer holidays and it's like, geez, they only get 2 months off. That's hardly any time at all. But do you remember when you were a kid getting all excited about the summer holidays coming up? But by the second week of the summer holidays, I'm bored. There's nothing to do, and you're only 2 weeks in, and how the summer seemed to stretch forever. Well, what that means, in terms of your ability to appreciate the passage of time and conceptualize what, 3 days means versus 13 days. Well, a child who is young and sees a parent every other weekend only sees that parent once every 12 days. And 12 days is an incredibly long period of time for a kid who is 4 or 5 or even 6. That's a very long time to be away from the other parent. So when you're thinking about children's ability to understand time, you think about the short, frequent visits that toddlers and younger children might enjoy. It's necessary so that they have that frequent contact with the other parent. But teenagers, hell, I have seen parenting schedules that work fine, where a teenager, is 2 weeks away from one parent and then spends 2 weeks with that parent, right? So all sorts of things. Other things to think about are how often are the transitions happening between homes? How does that affect how the children cope at school? Friends of mine who are school teachers usually hate Mondays because Monday is a frequent transition day. And if it's not Monday, it's Sunday. And so kids will be out of sort. They'll be cranky because they're making that difficult adaptation from the home of parent A to the home of parent B. Maybe they were involved in conflict with the parent or saw conflict between their parents. Who knows? So all of these things and others are things that are important to think about. So here are some sample schedules, right? And again, remember, none of these are right. So when a parent doesn't have huge amounts of time with the child, perhaps because of the nature of their relationship with the child, their work schedule, or their parenting capacity. These are schedules geared for that kind of relationship. And I should say that when I started to practice law, way back when, I mean, it's not that long ago, from my perspective anyways, but the expectation was that you would have one parent with whom the child lived almost all of the time, and the other parent would see them every other weekend. And that was thought to be a good schedule because it was frequent, it was reliable, and the idea was that it would preserve the children from being exposed to the conflict between their parents. But that is a ridiculously small amount of time, and it's ridiculously infrequent. But the wisdom at the time was that this is what was best for kids. And then as we kind of grew up and started thinking about things, well, what about Wednesdays for dinner? And then all of a sudden, Wednesdays for dinner became Tuesdays and Thursdays for dinner. And then Tuesdays and Thursdays for dinner became, well, what about Tuesday overnights or Wednesday overnights plus every other weekend? So lots of thinking has changed about the assumptions that judges and lawyers make about parenting schedules. And remember, please, for yourself, that there is no one right schedule. So when a parent has that kind of limited every other weekend kind of time, here are some options, right? Well, there's the every other weekend example, which means 12 days of separation, which is often not nearly enough, especially for younger children. It means that that parent will have the kids for 4 nights out of every 28 nights. It's not a lot of time. Things to consider here is that that kind of schedule, may give the residential parent lots of comfort, knowing that they're the one who's driving the train and being primarily responsible for the kids. But it also means that they hardly ever get any time off. It also means that the parent who doesn't live with the kids most of the time hardly has any opportunity themselves to engage with the kids, right? Because remember, parenting isn't about taking the kids to, Callaway Park or to go see a movie. Parenting is not about being the fun parent versus the mean disciplinarian parent. Parenting is about things like, feeding the kids a nutritious diet, even when they don't feel like eating their broccoli or their green beans. It means making sure they go to bed on time, even though they're whining and complaining about going to bed at 8 o'clock. It means making sure they've done their homework, even though they don't feel like it, right? So parenting isn't just about having a great time. It's about being involved in the day-to-day functions involved in raising a child, caring for them when they're sick, making sure they brush their teeth and washed their face and brushed their hair, right? So if that schedule isn't enough, well, some schedules talk about every other weekend plus a visit every midweek. Well, it doesn't increase the number of overnights that the parent has, but it does mean that they're seeing the kids more frequently. But even though the maximum distance between one visit and the other is going to be about 7 days, for some younger kids, 7 days is still far too long between parents. Other problems that come up with the idea, with this great idea about midweek contact, because it is a good idea, and lots of parents really enjoy the idea that, well, I'm going to have the kids every other weekend, but at least I'll see them every Tuesday and Thursday or whatever it is. But the problem that you sometimes run into is that, well, if it's hectic getting from the home of parent A to parent B, well, that kind of increases a little bit of stress, and it means that, you don't have the same chance to unwind and relax and really enjoy being in the company of your child or the child in the company of the parent, right? It may impact on your ability to get homework done. It may disrupt bedtime routines, but having said all of that, it's still a good idea to increase contact between the parents. Another way of dealing with this is to take the definition of whatever weekend means and to expand it a bit. So maybe weekends start Friday after school and end on Monday at the start of school, or maybe Tuesday at the start of school. So you can expand some of the time. Um, uh, Exchanges or patterns of parenting that require a parent to drop off the kids at school or pick them up from school, be careful, because you have to be able to do that. And if that one parent lives, like, again, in the furthest north of the Northwest, and the other parent lives in the furthest south of the Southeast, those plans about picking kids up from school or dropping them off just may not be workable. Now, when the non-residential parent has more time, well, you can do all sorts of great things. You can take the idea of every other weekend and throw in, instead of Wednesday for dinner, but Wednesday overnight, right? The more overnights you get, the more time you get, the less distance there is between seeing the parent and seeing the parent again. But the more time the non-residential parent has, the more they have to be prepared to and be capable of participating in schooling issues, homework issues, extracurricular activities like soccer and baseball and all the rest. The residential parent will like this schedule because they get more downtime, more time to just, hang out with them and their adult friends, and not have to worry about being a parent 24/7. Expanded this pattern might include that expanded weekend idea, so that there's weekends that are 3 overnights in length plus midweek, whatever, and you can, like I said, you can manage these things as you want. And then the next step up in terms of the balance of the parenting time would be a shared parenting time, where the children's time is split between each parent on a more or less equal basis. Now, I'm going to say a few things about this right now. Again, when I started to practice, the idea of shared parenting was really something that wasn't heard of. That every other weekend thing was considered to be quite normal. And if you really had a good parent, well, maybe you'd expand it to include that midweek overnight or a midweek dinner or something like that. And the concerns about shared parenting schedules were the child needs stability. They need to have a home that they call a home. We need to reduce the amount of time that the parents come into contact with each other in order to reduce the likelihood that the children will be exposed to their parents' conflict, and blah, 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 blah. As time has gone on, however, the frequency of parents who have an equal or almost equal amount of time with their kids has really increased. Over time, we have seen this being uncoupled from roles during the relationship in terms of who was the primary caregiver, if anybody, and we've seen it unplugged from things like, well, you work full time. How on earth could you have the kids for a whole week? How are you going to accommodate that? So these schedules are more and more commonplace. But, and this is a big but, the big but, just like Stir Mix-a-Lot, is that it has to still be appropriate for the kids, and for each parent. It has to be workable and doable. And whatever it is, it has to be a parenting plan that is in the best interests of the child. Okay. Quite a while ago, I remember somebody came to see me, and they said, well, I want to have a shared parenting schedule. And I said, well, that's great. Tell me why. Well, because it's equal. Okay, but the Divorce Act and the Family Law Act is only concerned about the schedule that is in the best interests of your child. So how is the schedule in the best interests of your child? Well, because it's fair. Well, but why is it fair? Well, it's fair because it's equal. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that a mathematically equal division of a child's time has got no relationship to whether that particular division of the child's time is in fact in the child's best interests. Mathematical fairness or mathematical ideas of parenting time have an impact on child support. In general, the amount of child support that gets paid goes down, right? But you still have to be able to support that schedule as being in the best interests of the child. And in general, when you have, and this is the lowest threshold, in general, when you have two parents who were more or less equally involved in raising the child, who have more or less equal parenting skills, a shared parenting schedule like that is great. When you have a parent, however, who is an absentee and is insisting on shared parenting merely because they get a discount from child support, that's kind of the circumstance when, their parenting skills and their relationship with their child doesn't necessarily support the idea that they should have their child for an equal amount of time. But when you do have a shared parenting schedule, there are a whole bunch of other things to think about, right? Is the schedule predictable? This is especially important for kids who have homework and kids who have varying schedules like what you see in middle school and high school, because kids need to know, what books do I need to have with me for my class next week? What home am I going to be? What books do I need to take home, right? You need to think about the number of times the kids transition between homes. For parents who get along really well and have similar parenting styles, that kind of thing may not be a problem, right? But if the differences between homes are really big, those kind of transitions may be too difficult for the kids. Another factor that goes into the frequency of transitions includes the level of conflict between the parents. If you're in a relationship where you simply cannot stop yelling at the other parent every time you see them, you really want to minimize the number of times you see them, right? And so you think about things like, well, instead of dropping them off at mom's house or dad's house, what if we exchange them through school? Which is, by the way, a brilliant way of dealing with conflict between parents. You need to think about the age of the kids and whether the time away from one parent or the other parent is something that they can manage. You need to think about the complexity of stuff like, if they go to private school, we have to have a wardrobe at each home. If they play soccer, they need to have, they need to either have a duplicate set of gear at mom's house and the other mom's house, or they need to have a duffel bag that they carry between homes on the weekends, or whatever the case is. You also need to think, how well can the parents work together to make all of this work? How well can the parents problem solve basic functioning questions? So here are some examples. This is a 2-2-3 split. In other words, with parent A for 2 days, followed by parent B for 2 days, followed by parent A for 3 days. And as you can see, the 3-day period rotates from time to time. This is a mathematically equal division of the child's time. It's going to be good for kids who don't have a rigid school schedule, kids who don't have homework, and it's going to be good for kids who are younger because of the frequency of the contact between each parent. But it does assure that each parent has a mathematically precisely equal share of the children's time. Another schedule, which is less confusing for kids, and it's one, frankly, that I really like, is this 2-2-5-5 schedule. And this schedule works where parent A always has the kids on Monday and Tuesday. Parent B always has the kids on Wednesday and Thursday. And what happens is the weekend, 3 days long, from Friday until Sunday, flips between parents, right? So what it means is that the minimum amount of time each parent has in 1 week is going to be 3 days. The most amount of time is going to be 4 days. The longest amount of time with one parent is going to be a stretch of 5 days, and the shortest is going to be a stretch of 2 days. And so this is good because the kids always know where they're going to be on those 2 days that happen to be fixed. And of course, if you work shift work or your days off occur midweek, there's nothing stopping you from switching those fixed days around, right? The point, though, is to have a schedule that's consistent, that's predictable. It allows the frequent contact that younger kids are going to like. It makes things easier for preteens and teens in terms of scheduling their social lives and in terms of knowing where they're going to be. A split that requires less transitions between homes, and you see that this schedule only requires 1 transition a week at most. Well, 2, I suppose. Yeah, 2. Is a schedule where, it's a 4-3 split, right? So each parent, so a parent in 1 week has 4 days, the next week they have 3, the week after they have 4, the week after they have 3, right? And again, you can schedule those exchange dates anytime you want. Some people might put that Wednesday exchange pattern on Saturday instead. But again, I would generally speaking encourage parents to avoid splitting up weekends, and even though that's exactly what this schedule does, it's just an example. But I would encourage you not to split up weekends because that's the time when the kids are going to be off school, and it's the time where when you want to go camping, you want to go camping for the whole weekend, not just for 1 day. So, and then the simplest schedule of all, which is going to be suitable for older kids, say kids who are 9 and older, is a week on, week off schedule. And that exchange can happen at any time. But the beauty of something that is as simple as this, or even as simple as this, is that you can arrange the exchange of the child to happen at great because the parents never have to see each other, and the transition between homes is easier for the kids. And even if the parents do in this map exchange them in person once a week, well, it's only once a week. There isn't that kind of extremely frequent level of contact that you see with schedules like this, where you can see that each week there's three transitions, right, and three chances for face-to-face contact. So all sorts of things to think about. And then lastly, I should talk about this other potential parenting arrangement called a split custodial arrangement. And this is a case where one or more siblings live primarily with each parent. Bob might have the youngest kid, and Frank may have the two older kids, for example, right? It is really rare that parents would agree, or the court would order, or an arbitrator would award that kids get split up, siblings get split up. But I have seen it happen. And in general, when I've seen it happen and all the kids have the same people as parents, they get split up because one kid is just a bully, right? Where there's persistent emotional and physical abuse and sometimes sexual abuse. Because what I'm looking for, right, when deciding that a split arrangement is going to be best, is it has to be in the best interests of the children. So why would that be the case? It might be the case because the kids have different adults who are their parents. They may be better bonded with a biological parent than with a non-biological parent. The kids who have another parent may already be involved in a parenting schedule with that individual, making it far too complicated to split them up versus the other kids, their stepkids, right? I've seen it happen when the siblings are really different in age, where you've got like a 14-year-old and a 2-year-old, right? That might support it. And the obvious reason why that might be supported is because the parenting schedule that works for a 14-year-old is way different than the parenting schedule that works best for a 2-year-old, right? And finally, just like shared parenting, a split arrangement also affects how child support gets paid, right? And in general, again, it goes down. And don't worry about that. We can talk about that later if you want. The other thing to think about is, what do the children want? And this is something that would have been taboo when I first started to practice law, because, we have a general reluctance to involve the kids in their parents' dispute. But the trick, though, is to ask what they want, but make sure that they understand that while they have a voice, they are not being asked to choose between their parents or decide themselves what their parenting program is going to look like. And in fact, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is law in Canada and in Alberta, requires that judges and arbitrators hear the views and preferences of kids when making decisions about matters that affect their interests, like their parenting schedule or like how their parents make decisions about them. So it can be really important. The other crazy thing is that some research was done in 2012 by two mental health professionals from Ontario, Michael Saini and Rachel Birnbaum. And they did a study of hundreds of studies from all around the world about the impact on kids of having their voices heard in making decisions about parenting after separation. And what they found is that these studies support the idea that kids are more likely to be satisfied with their parenting arrangements when they've been asked what they want, and are more likely to see the arrangement that is made as being fair if they're spoken to. And that's actually really important. So these are good things to think about. Kids like and appreciate being asked what their views are. It's important to make sure they understand they're not being asked to make an adult decision. Details. Right. So as I said before, seems like quite a while ago now, parents who are in greater levels of conflict need greater levels of detail in their agreements. Parents who are in less level of conflict need less amount of conflict. Lower levels of conflict is valuable, and it's not just a matter of protecting the kids from the harmful effects of conflict between parents, but it's good as a parent, right? You want to be able to phone up the other parent and say, look, I know it's your weekend with the kids, but Aunt Millie died and the funeral is this weekend, and I'd really like to take them to Aunt Millie's funeral, right? And Parents who are in lower levels of conflict usually are grown up enough and mature enough to say, yeah, that'd be great, no problem. Fine, take that. And parents are able to accommodate, I'm sick, I just don't feel that I can get out of bed. Can you keep the kids for an extra couple of days? And this is really good, right? That kind of relationship is, as separated parents is really ideal. It's hard to get there sometimes, but it's ideal. So with lower levels of conflict, you can accommodate short-term change. You don't need to have as much detail. You don't need to be as rigid. You can include dispute resolution options. In other words, ways of resolving disagreements about parenting issues, not by going to court or by going to see an arbitrator, but by consulting a parenting expert or going to see a mediator or talking to an elder or somebody else who's valued and important in your community, like a priest, a rabbi, or an imam. It's good when adults are able to get along with each other. So here is a really good low conflict parenting plan. Sally will have the kids every other weekend and for several hours Tuesday and Thursday, right? And because Sally and Erica get along well enough, we don't need to really get into the details about what does weekend mean and what does several hours every Tuesday and Thursday night look like, or when does after school begin. But when people are in elevated levels of conflict, you're looking at a much different thing. You can't just say every other weekend because, well, when does the weekend start? According to my calendar, the weekend starts on Saturdays. So now you have to be specific. Sally will have the children every other weekend from Friday, from the end of school, or from 4 p.m. on Fridays that are not school days until the following Sunday at 5 p.m., unless the Friday is a statutory holiday, in which case Sally will have the children beginning from Thursdays at 4 p.m. or the end of school, or until the following Monday if Monday is a statutory holiday or a civic holiday. Sally will make her best efforts to be prompt and on time in dropping off the kids and picking them up. In the event Sally's going to be late, she'll give notice. Oh, it goes on and on and on. And so I have drafted parenting plans for people in extreme levels of conflict that went on for 8 solid single-spaced pages, talking about nuances and details, like what happens if a parent is sick. Is makeup time available? Do they have to provide a doctor's note? Do they have to provide compensation for expenses that were thrown away because of planning to be able to see the kids when it turned out they couldn't see them? How do you handle statutory holidays? What do you do when somebody can't drive? If somebody else has to drive, is that parent required to produce a driver's abstract for all the potential substitute drivers so that the other parent can be sure that those parents are safe drivers? And it goes on and on and on. So some things that cause conflict that you need to remember. Okay, so this is just like a mental checklist of things that you've got to cover in a parenting plan that talks about time. Don't forget to book the children's non-instructional days, professional development days, other non-instructional days like parent-teacher interviews, as soon as the schools publish their annual calendars, and that usually gets released sometime early August. My ex and I, we have a calendar through our iPhones, and we're both able to add to that calendar and take things away. So when I schedule a doctor's appointment, it goes into the shared calendar. My ex can see when the doctor's appointment is, and she can talk to me about it. We also know who's going to be caring after the children when there's a non-instructional day. Plan for not just statutory holidays, but civic holidays that are not statutory holidays, religious holidays that are important but not necessarily statutory holidays. Don't forget about the breaks from school. Do not forget Halloween. This is something that can be a fantastic source of conflict. In general, over time, the amount of Halloweens a child has with parent A will balance the number of Halloweens a child has with parent B, but you can't be certain. And there will sometimes, just through some quirk in the calendar, be 3 Halloweens in a row where the child is with one parent than the other. So, usually you plan to rotate that stuff. Usually you plan to rotate children's birthdays. Parents' birthdays might be something you want to plan for too, maybe not. Most people also want to plan for Mother's Day and Father's Day. So think about these things, go through a mental checklist, right? And you want to have an agreement that is as comprehensive as possible to avoid conflict. Now, one last thing to say about parenting schedules. Regardless of how you come up with your parenting plan, whether it's something that you have in an agreement between you and your ex, an arbitrator's award, or a court order, You can address circumstances where there are problems with one parent, such as a history of family violence or the presence of mental health concerns or addiction concerns and other things along those lines. And you can still encourage contact between that parent and the kids without just cutting them off. In general, even where a parent has serious deficiencies as a parent, it's still in children's best interest to be able to see them sometimes. But when you're drafting a parenting plan, you can come up with terms that are intended to accommodate that. So when the parents are in really high levels of conflict with each other, they can't see each other without arguing. Sometimes the exchange of kids will be supervised by a third party, such as an agency that supervises exchanges. Ontario in particular has a bunch of programs that do that sort of thing. Maybe it's that a third party, like a relative or a friend, takes the kids from one home to the other. Or maybe the exchanges always happen at school, something like that. When a parent, and potentially poses a risk to the well-being of children when they're with them, however, you might have supervised parenting time. This will happen where the parent is only allowed to see the kids under the supervision of somebody else. Again, there are professional agencies that provide this sort of service, or sometimes the supervisor might be a mutual friend or a family member or things like that. Also, it can sometimes be an option that maybe supervision isn't required, but conditions are imposed. So an agreement might say, Sally can have the kids every other weekend on the condition that for a 24-hour period before and during Sally's time with the children, Sally refrains from the consumption of alcohol or prescription drugs, something like that, or non-prescription drugs. Or Sally can have the kids on the condition that she doesn't drive with them, or that if she drives with them, she makes sure that they are in their safety seats and buckled in. And you could imagine other terms of contact might include not drinking, not smoking around the kids, not exposing the kids to specified other individuals, and things like that. So moving on, decision making. So there are a whole menu of ways that you and the other parent can address how you're going to make decisions about the kids. So one way of doing it is to say that we will just simply share decision-making responsibilities. We're both guardians of the kids. We're both entitled to input. We have a history of being able to cooperate. We, in general, have a fairly lined up view about parenting and our philosophy of parenting. And in a case like that, what it means is that if we decide that our kids need to transition from middle school to high school, we talk to each other to decide what that high school is going to be. We talk to each other about medical appointments and courses of treatment when a child needs medical or mental health care, things like that. In general, you've got to have pretty good dispute resolution skills, and you've got to have really good communication skills, right? Because, a plan where you both make decisions about the kids means that you both have to cooperate. And to cooperate, you have to talk to each other, right? Another common way of doing it is to say that, well, both guardians will have the obligation to talk to each other when making decisions about the kids. But in the event that the parents can't agree, one guardian will have the final say, right? This is sometimes called the ultimate decision-making authority, language around that line. So this requires an initial burst of cooperation, but in the event that you just can't reach a compromise, the parent who has that ultimate decision-making authority just says, no, they're not going to play baseball, they're going to play soccer. The other parent who's not happy with that outcome always has the choice of taking that decision, going to see a mediator if that's what's been agreed, but if agreements haven't been reached, then they'll go to court, something like that. And what they need to do is convince the judge at that point that the decision that the other parent made is not in the child's best interests. This requires good communication skills, good conflict resolution skills, but not as good as when neither parent has the final say. It is, however, a fairly common arrangement. Sometimes, and now we're getting into elevated levels of conflict between parents, but still situations where each parent is reasonably competent and they're a good parent. Sometimes you might engage in something called parallel parenting, where all of the different facets of the children's lives that require decisions are split between each parent, right? So one guardian, for example, might have responsibility for healthcare decisions. The other parent might have responsibility for education decisions and extracurricular activities. This is really best reserved for parents who have really different philosophies about parenting. Like to take the medical care issue, let's say, for example, that one of the parents is a member of a religion that restricts certain kinds of medical treatments like blood transfusions. And the other parent, however, does not subscribe to that particular religion and might think that, well, blood transfusions are necessary to save my child's life. In a case like that, especially when a judge can't decide for you what the decision ought to be, the judge will often decide, well, it'll be that parent who has the exclusive right to make decisions about healthcare. But again, it's not great. It's easy to have conflicts. One parent might schedule medical appointments for the time when the other parent is scheduling soccer lessons, something like that. Another kind of parallel parenting that is actually, they're both called parallel parenting, but they have radically different meanings. This other meaning of parallel parenting is essentially what happens in my house is my business. What happens in your house is your business. So that when the kids are with me, I have exclusive and complete decision-making authority over every aspect of their lives. And when they are with you, you have that responsibility. So that can be difficult because obviously some things like school need to be a shared decision. But if the parents just simply cannot cooperate with each other, I mean, how on earth do you ever go about scheduling extracurricular activities, knowing that hardly any extracurricular activities are scheduled on an every other week basis? So that can be really quite challenging. And again, not healthy, not helpful, best reserved for parents in huge levels of conflict. And then finally, when parents are in extraordinary levels of conflict, or when a parent has never really been involved in the child's life, you might have an arrangement where only one parent or only one guardian makes all these is responsible for making all of these decisions. So a judge will sometimes do this where both parents are guardians. If the parents are in such a level of conflict that they can't agree on everything, but a judge is not prepared to go so far as to strip one of the parents of their standing as a guardian of the child, right? So they'll say, fine, you can still be a guardian, but you have no say in making these decisions about this child. They will all be exercised by the other parent. So we're looking at situations where a parent has a mental health disorder that really has an impact on their capacity to communicate with the other parent or make decisions or be rational in their approach to decision making. When a parent, is a parent of a child but was never really involved in the child's life, maybe never even lived with the child, or if a parent, has just sort of decided to absent themselves after the parents have separated. And the benefit, of course, in a case like that, just to finish up the slide, is that, if the other parent has just said, screw you, and then moved to the Maritimes, well, it can be really challenging to get their consent when you have to go to a dental treatment and the dentist requires the consent of both parents. Same thing for medical decisions, same thing with mental health decisions, right? So, or getting a passport from Passport Canada, right? So in a case like that, it's sometimes extremely helpful to go to court and get an order that allows you to be the only person responsible for making decisions so that you never have to consult the other person. And what you do when the teachers say, well, we need the consent of the other parent to enroll them in school, you show them the court order that says that only you are required to make that decision. So other general considerations. How well did you and the other parent work together in the past? How well do you work together now? How similar or how different are your approaches to parenting time? Do you have religious differences that indicate really different lifestyles for the child? How did you allocate those decision-making responsibilities when you were together? And remember that example I was using before when I was talking about the strengths and weaknesses of parents? Quite often, the parent who was always responsible for booking parent-teacher interviews when the relationship was intact is still the same person who continues to be responsible for doing that after parents have separated. And it's not the case that the other parent is being lazy. It's just that one parent has always done it. Same thing when that one parent has always booked doctor's appointments or dental appointments, or when that one parent has always been responsible for coaching the kids' hockey teams and buying new hockey equipment and stuff like that. Um, you have to think about whether or not a parent has a special talent or preference for a particular kind of thing, special knowledge or a special familiarity. Like one parent may know their child's ADHD requirements or ODD requirements backwards and forwards, but the other parent has always been kind of hands off. That might have an influence on things as well. When parents are in low levels of conflict, they can have an agreement that just simply says, we'll make all decisions about the kids together, or, all decisions about the children will require our agreement. That's great. When there are higher levels of conflict, and again, bearing in mind that the function of a parenting plan is to reduce conflict and help people predict the future, sometimes you want to be more detailed. And when you have to be more detailed, it can really help to use a checklist to make sure that you've covered everything off. For example, you might forget about the orthodontist. You may have covered the dentist, but you didn't talk about orthodontics. You talked about the GP, but you didn't talk about the pediatrician or the endocrinologist, right? So make a list. Go through that list, talk to other people. What does your list look like? Go online, look for lists, right? And there are some really great resources that I'll show you about in a second. So when we're talking about healthcare, well, how do we exchange information about the names and contact information for the healthcare providers? How do we make sure that the results of a particular test are communicated not just with me, but with the other parent? Who will take the kids to the medical visits? Will it be just one of us, or must both of us be there? Is there another way in the age of COVID-19 to get the other parent up to speed, such as video conferencing or being present by teleconference? When you make a scheduled appointment, is the other parent entitled to know about it? Are they entitled to participate? All those questions. Dental care. Don't forget about orthodontics. Don't forget about making decisions about dental care and choices of orthodontic treatment, primarily because that stuff can be super expensive, right? And if it's a choice between a cheaper program of orthodontia and a more expensive one, you need to talk about that with the other parent in particular. Mental health care, who gets to know what's going on, who gets to decide if a treatment should be incurred, who gets to know what the child says to the therapist, and so on. Education. How do you share information about the child's report cards, about absences and lates? Who gets to approve a child's IPP? Who gets to go to school meetings? How do you know when they are? Are both parents entitled to attend? Should you have separate meetings with the teacher? Should you be there jointly, and things like that? How do you pay for school fees? Who gets to give or withhold permission for a trip to the Bayou Ranch and things like that? Travel. This is a particularly important one that you really must not forget. Who gets to apply for passports? Who has to give consent? Who gets to keep the passports? Because those are really important and they also have some value to them. Where can a parent travel without having to get the other permission from the parent? Obviously, if you live in Calgary, you ought to be able to go to IKEA if you live in the Northwest without having to get permission to make that trip. On the other hand, should you be able to drive to Brooks or Coldwater without getting the other parent's permission? Can you travel from here to Vancouver without the other parent's permission, or do you have to get that? When you do travel, what kind of information do you have to provide ahead of time and when you're there? Typically, we're talking about contact information, the name of where you're staying, the phone number of where you're staying. Sometimes travel also involves making promises about the kids will be able to talk to you on every Tuesday and Thursday while I'm away. We'll do FaceTime or some other sort of sharing of the children's time. So think about all that stuff, and again, go through it in your mind. Think about all the details, all the complications. Don't forget about consent letters that are required when you cross a border into a different country. Try to plan ahead as much as you possibly can. And then other things to think about. Is diet a concern? Do we need to think about, what we can and cannot feed the kids? Sometimes there's a religious component to that as well. How do we make decisions about things like haircuts and getting ears pierced? Some parents will absolutely lose it when their kid comes back with their ears pierced, because ear piercings are, they can't be undone without surgery, of course. But, as kids get older, tattoos and all the other sort of body modification type things. So think about all these other things. and make plans to address them in your parenting plan. And again, the less conflict you're in, the more general you can be. The higher your conflict is, the more comprehensive you want to be. Don't forget to include some plan for how you're going to resolve disagreements, because quite often there will be disagreements. Will you go see a mediator? Will you consult an elder? Will you consult a religious leader, like a priest, a imam, or a rabbi? Will you consult a parenting expert, a mental health professional, like a counselor? Will you go to court? Is that how you resolve disputes? So let's talk about some of those resources that I had in mind. So in general, you want to look from information from quality sources, right? So the people whose parenting plans I showed you before were William Hodges and Robert Alder, but other authorities include Michael Lamb and Joan Kelly. Joan Kelly in particular is one, she's retired now, but she was at the time, one of the foremost authorities on parenting after separation in all of North America. Whatever she writes is really worth paying attention to. She's quite brilliant and expresses herself in an easy to understand way. So look for authoritative sources. Wherever you're looking for parenting plans, you should be looking for parenting plans or ideas about parenting schedules that differentiate between children who don't have special needs, children who do. They should be varied by parenting capacity between parent A and parent B. They should vary according to the child's age, sometimes also with their maturity and stage of development. I mentioned before that a number of U.S. states actually have parenting plans or guidelines that they've published. They include the states that I've listed there. And then child-focused books like Helping Your Kids Cope with Divorce the Sandcastles Way by Gary Newman is also a really helpful resource because it takes an ages and stages approach to talking about kids and to planning parenting times, and an ages and stages approach to talking to your kids about your separation from the other parent. Go online, Google using the terms that I've suggested there. In general, you really have to be cautious of websites that are geared only to mothers, websites that are only geared to fathers, websites that are, that are full of personal testimonials and complaints, because in general, those sources are not going to be the most neutral and perhaps the most authoritative in their approaches to parenting schedules, right? So be careful of the source. You want to look, generally speaking, for the websites of government officials or public legal education authorities. So I've given you the address here for the basic family law website provided by the Federal Department of Justice and the family law website provided by the Alberta government. Below that is the website of the Centre for Public Legal Education Alberta, CPLEA. And CPLEA publishes a bunch of really helpful family law resources. You go there and you click on subject and you click on family law, and it will give you tons of material about parenting plans, about grandparents' ability to spend time with kids, about child support, and about other things that relate to family law. And the best thing about the CPLEA materials is I guarantee they're going to come across and be presented in a neutral, unbiased way. So here's the primary Alberta website. Under the heading of life events, divorce and separation. They have a bunch of really helpful information here. And if you click on parenting after separation, you'll get options that include the parenting after separation course. This is a free in-person, well, used to be in-person. It's a free online course that helps you learn about parenting and communication strategies after separation that can sometimes be extraordinarily helpful. And when you and the other parent are in extreme levels of conflict, there's a companion to this course after you've taken it called the Parenting After Separation for Families in High Conflict course. Also really helpful. Lots of really high quality free public information materials that you can download from the website. Then there's the Families Change website, and I think the address is familieschange.ca. And this is an online parenting after separation course. And as you can see, it varies by province. When you click on Alberta, this is what you get. And what's so awesome about this is that the information about parenting after separation is not just for adults, but they have separate websites for children who are under the age of 12 and a separate website for teenagers, right? And so those websites are geared towards the special interests that teens have, level of language and reading ability and all that other sort of stuff. The parent's guide will talk about parenting plans, how to talk to the other parent, and how to make plans for the parenting of your kids. This is the federal website through the Department of Justice. The federal website has lots of really useful stuff, including a lot of research materials that you can find online. Those are papers and studies that the federal government has commissioned. But what's so amazingly cool is their parenting plan tool. And so if you click on at the bottom, create a parenting plan, you get links to this, which is available in PDF format. And also in physical format. This is a paper publication you may be able to find at the library. A really helpful companion to this book, Making Plans, is also this book here, which is written for kids called What Happens Next, which is about helping kids and teenagers understand separation and gives them some guidance about things like how to avoid being caught up in your parents' conflict. But what's really cool about the federal website, they also have a checklist you can download so that you'll cover off all the things I was talking about before, like making arrangements for travel, right? But what's really cool is their parenting plan tool. So this tool, it lets you input your name, the other parent's name, and the names of your children. And then as you go through the tool, you click off different boxes, right? Like in this example, I just said, we agree that we will make decisions that are in the best interests of our children and will put their interests ahead of our own. And you can click all of these boxes if you want. There are boxes about, your responsibility to the other parent, boxes about how you make decisions about the kids. There's even a whole slew of this about parenting options in terms of the division of the parenting schedule. And when you get through all of this, it will email you a PDF form of your parenting plan. Fantastic resource. It's not comprehensive. It's not as good as the customized material that you would get from a lawyer. But boy, it's awesome. And it's something you can do yourself without having to spend without having to spend a dime on legal advice. So that's the end of the material that I had prepared for this conversation. And now I would be really happy to take any comments or questions that